Special Agent Miller slid the manila folder across the table with practiced precision. It stopped just short of Officer Frank Callahan's trembling hands. The older man's weathered face was flushed, his white hair disheveled from repeatedly running his fingers through it. "You want to explain this to me, Officer Callahan?" Miller's voice was ice cold. The second FBI agent, Ramirez, stood silently in the corner, arms crossed, dark sunglasses obscuring his eyes despite the fluorescent lighting of the small room at the East Bridge Police Department. Callahan scoffed, a mixture of nervousness and contempt. "I already told you, those allegations are bullshit. 28 years on the force, and suddenly I'm taking bribes? Come on." "Then explain the offshore account," Miller said, opening the folder to reveal bank statements. $50,000 deposited in 5 installments over the past year, coincidentally matching the dates when evidence went missing in the Dominguez case. Callahan's face drained of color. That's my retirement fund. My brother-in-law handles investments for me." "Your brother-in-law, who lives in the Cayman Islands?" Ramirez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "No, he just set up the account there. Tax purposes." Callahan's collar suddenly felt too tight. He tugged at it, revealing a flush of red creeping up his neck. "And I suppose it's also a coincidence that you were the responding officer on all 5 traffic stops where cocaine mysteriously vanished from the evidence room." Miller pushed another document forward. "Officer Callahan, we've been watching you for months." "This is ridiculous," Callahan stammered, pushing back from the table. "I want my union rep. I'm not saying another word without representation." Miller smiled thinly. "That's your right. But before we call him, there's something you should know." He nodded to Ramirez, who produced a small tablet from his jacket pocket. "Remember Luis Dominguez, the dealer you arrested last March?" "What about him?" Callahan's voice had dropped to a whisper. Ramirez tapped the tablet, and a video began playing. It showed Callahan, clearly intoxicated, laughing with a man whose face was partially obscured. Money changed hands. Then, Callahan's voice, slurred but unmistakable, "Don't worry about the evidence. It'll disappear, just like last time. These idiots trust me 28 years. They think I'm a fucking saint." The blood drained from Callahan's face. That's not what it looks like." "Really?" Miller leaned forward. "Because it looks like a dirty cop taking a bribe to tamper with evidence. It looks like betrayal of public trust. It looks like a minimum of 20 years in federal prison." "You can't. That video is inadmissible. You didn't have a warrant." "We didn't need one," Ramirez said, removing his sunglasses to reveal eyes filled with disgust. "Luis Dominguez has been working with us for the past year. Every conversation you had was recorded with his consent. Single-party consent state, remember?" The realization hit Callahan like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the 2 FBI agents thought he might collapse. "I want a deal," Callahan whispered. "I bet you do," Miller replied, closing the folder. "But first, we need to know everything. Every case you compromised, every dollar you took, every drunk driving incident you covered up. Everything." And in that moment, as the weight of his choices came crashing down, Officer Frank Callahan began to talk. 6 months earlier, Frank Callahan had never planned to become corrupt. Like most stains on a person's character, it had started small and spread slowly. 6 months before the FBI interview, Frank had been patrolling the eastern district of Eastbridge, a once prosperous manufacturing town now struggling with unemployment and a growing drug problem. The night was unusually warm for March, and Frank had just finished his second whiskey at O'Malley's bar when his radio crackled to life. "All units, we have reports of a disturbance at the Pineview Apartments, possible drug activity. Any officers in the vicinity, please respond." Frank wasn't supposed to be drinking on duty. It was a line he had started crossing about 3 years ago, after his wife Elaine died from cancer. Just a drink or two to take the edge off, he told himself. Never enough to be noticeable, or so he thought. "Dispatch, this is Callahan. I'm 2 blocks from Pineview. Responding now." He slipped a breath mint into his mouth, adjusted his badge, and drove carefully to the apartment complex. By the time he arrived, the disturbance had quieted. Frank climbed the concrete stairs to apartment 303, where the call had originated. He knocked firmly. "Police! Open up!" The young man opened the door, his eyes widening at the sight of Frank's uniform. Behind him, Frank could see another man hastily shoving something under the couch. "Evening, officer," the man at the door said smoothly. "There's no problem here. Just had the music a little loud. We've turned it down now." Frank had been a cop long enough to recognize the signs. The nervous energy, the quick movements, the too casual demeanor. "Mind if I come in and take a look around?" "You got a warrant?" the man challenged, though his voice wavered slightly. Frank placed his hand on his holster, a practiced intimidation tactic. "I can get one, or we can keep this simple." The man hesitated, then stepped aside. Frank entered the apartment, immediately spotting the edge of a plastic bag peeking out from under the couch. He pulled it out with gloved hands. At least a kilo of cocaine. Street value of maybe 30. "Well, well," Frank said, looking between the two young men who now stood frozen. "Looks like you boys are in serious trouble." That's when Luis Dominguez, the man who had opened the door, made an offer that would change everything. "Officer, maybe we can work something out?" Dominguez said, his voice low. "That's a lot of product there, worth a lot to the right people." Frank should have arrested him on the spot, should have called for backup, should have done his job. Instead, he said, "I'm listening." $5,000. That was the price of Frank Callahan's integrity that night. $5,000 to lose the evidence and forget the address. He told himself it was a one-time thing. He told himself he deserved it after 28 years of service on a mediocre salary. He told himself a lot of things as he drove away from Pineview Apartments with cash in his pocket and a weight on his conscience. But the thing about crossing lines is that each subsequent transgression becomes easier. 1 month later, when Dominguez called him directly on his personal cell phone number, Frank never should have shared with another opportunity, the price went up to 80. And Frank said yes again. By September, Frank had established a routine with Dominguez and his associates. He would ensure that certain traffic stops resulted in confiscated drugs that never made it to the evidence room. He would tip them off about upcoming raids. Sometimes he would even plant evidence on rival dealers. His offshore account grew fatter. He bought a boat, nothing extravagant, just a small fishing vessel he'd always wanted but could never afford on a cop's salary. He told his colleagues it was an inheritance from a distant uncle. No one questioned it. The drinking got worse. Frank was no longer limiting himself to a whiskey or two during shifts. He kept a flask in his patrol car and drank steadily throughout the day. His superiors noticed his bloodshot eyes and the faint smell of alcohol that clung to him, but his record and reputation protected him. A quiet word here, a warning there, nothing official ever made it into his file. One rainy Tuesday in October, Frank hit a mailbox while driving his patrol car. He was well over the legal limit, having spent the afternoon at O'Malley's discussing another business arrangement with Dominguez. The crash wasn't serious, but it attracted attention. A young officer named Patel responded to the scene. "Officer Callahan?" Patel's voice was concerned as he approached the vehicle. "Are you all right, sir?" Frank fumbled with his seatbelt, his movements sluggish. Fine. Just hydroplaned a bit in the rain." Officer Patel leaned closer, and Frank knew instantly that the younger man could smell the whiskey on his breath. There was a moment of tension, the respect for a senior officer warring with the duty to enforce the law. "Sir, have you been drinking?" Patel asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Frank straightened up, summoning all the authority of his 28 years on the force. "You questioning me, Patel?" I skidded on wet pavement. "Write up the report for the mailbox damage and I'll handle it from here." Patel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." As the young officer walked back to his car to get the paperwork, Frank's phone buzzed. A text from Dominguez. "We have a problem. Meet tomorrow. Usual spot." The problem turned out to be significant. The FBI had started investigating drug trafficking patterns in Eastbridge. Dominguez had sources inside the courthouse who had tipped him off. "They're connecting dots, man," Dominguez told Frank the next day as they sat in the back booth of a diner 30 miles outside of town. "They've noticed the pattern of evidence going missing." They're looking at the officers involved in those cases. Frank felt the first real stirrings of fear. How close are they? Dominguez shrugged. Not sure. But we need to be careful. Maybe cool it for a few months. I can't cool it, Frank hissed, leaning forward. I've got bills. The boat needs repairs. And I've got a guy at Internal Affairs who's been asking questions about that DUI incident last month. That's your problem, not mine, Dominguez replied coldly. But if you go down, we all go down. Remember that. As Frank drove back to Eastbridge, a cold realization settled in his stomach like a stone. He was trapped. There was no walking away from this. No returning to the person he had been before. The money, the drinking, the corruption, it had all seemed so manageable at first. Now it was a runaway train, and he could feel the tracks running out ahead of him. December brought unusually cold weather to Eastbridge, along with increasing pressure on Frank. Officer Patel had filed a report about the mailbox incident, not mentioning the suspected DUI, but including enough details that Internal Affairs had questions. The FBI's presence in town had become more noticeable, with agents interviewing known associates of drug dealers. And Dominguez was getting nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. I need you to do something for me, Dominguez told Frank during a tense meeting in the parking lot of a closed-down factory. There's a shipment coming in tomorrow night, bigger than usual. I need you to be the responding officer if anything goes wrong. I can't control that, Frank protested. Dispatch assigns calls based on location. Figure it out, Dominguez snapped. This is important. If this goes well, we're set for months. Maybe you can take that retirement you keep talking about. The idea was tempting. Get through one more job, take the money, and disappear. Maybe to Florida or Arizona, somewhere warm where no one knew Officer Frank Callahan. The next night, Frank manipulated the patrol roster to ensure he would be in the vicinity of the warehouse where Dominguez's shipment was arriving. He had called in a favor with the dispatcher, claiming he needed to stay in the Eastern District to follow up on an ongoing investigation. Everything went smoothly until 11:42 p.m., when multiple patrol cars converged on the warehouse. Not responding to a call, this was a planned raid. Frank heard the chatter on his radio and realized with horror that someone had tipped off the department. He raced to the scene, arriving just as officers were leading Dominguez and 3 others out in handcuffs. From the shadows of his patrol car, Frank watched as an FBI agent supervised the loading of evidence into vans. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Don't try to intervene. Dominguez flipped. They know about you. Run. Frank's hands shook so badly he could barely put the car in drive. He bypassed his apartment, heading straight for the bank to withdraw as much cash as possible. Then he drove east, no destination in mind except away. He made it as far as a motel just outside the county line when red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. He had been so careful, kept to the speed limit, signaled every turn. But as he pulled over and saw 2 men in suits approach his car, he knew it wasn't about a traffic violation. Officer Frank Callahan? Special Agent Miller held up his badge. FBI, we'd like you to come with us back to Eastbridge. We have some questions about your relationship with Luis Dominguez. And so it had come full circle. From the moment in the interrogation room, when the video played, showing him drunk and accepting a bribe, Frank Callahan knew his life as he had known it was over. I want a deal, he had said. But the FBI wasn't interested in deals. They wanted names, dates, details, the full extent of corruption in the Eastbridge Police Department. And Frank, desperate to save himself from the maximum sentence, gave them everything. The questioning lasted for hours. Frank revealed how he had tampered with evidence in 7 different cases, how he had tipped off Dominguez about raids and surveillance, how he had driven drunk on duty at least 24 times in the past year alone, how Officer Patel had suspected his intoxication but had been pressured into silence. By the time they finished, the sun was setting outside the small window of the interrogation room. Frank's throat was raw from talking, his eyes red from a combination of exhaustion and the realization of what he had become. One last thing, Agent Miller said, gathering the papers and photographs that documented Frank's fall. The chief wants to see you. They led Frank, not in handcuffs, but broken nonetheless, to the office of Chief William Davis, the man who had been his friend for 20 years, who had attended Elaine's funeral, who had trusted him with the safety and well-being of their community. Davis didn't stand when Frank entered. He remained seated, his face carved from stone, his eyes reflecting not anger but something worse, disappointment. "Why, Frank?" The question hung in the air between them. Frank sank into the chair across from the desk. "I don't know, Bill. After Elaine, I started making excuses, a drink to get through the shift, a little extra money for the retirement she and I always planned. Then it got away from me." 28 years, Davis said quietly. 28 years of service, thrown away. Do you know what this will do to the department? To the community's trust in us? Frank had no answer. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "The FBI wants to make an example of you," Davis continued. "Public corruption trial. Maximum publicity. They're talking 20 to 25 years. At 62, that was essentially a life sentence. Frank felt a moment of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. "There's nothing you can do?" he asked, hating the pleading note in his voice. Davis shook his head slowly. "Even if I wanted to, Frank, I'm not saying I'd do this as federal now. It's out of my hands." He pushed back from his desk. "Officer Franklin Callahan, I am officially terminating your employment with the Eastbridge Police Department, effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and service weapon." With trembling hands, Frank placed his badge on the desk, the shield he had once worn with pride, now a symbol of his disgrace. His service weapon had already been confiscated by the FBI. As he stood to leave, Davis spoke one final time. "The department psychiatrist suggested you were suffering from undiagnosed PTSD after Elaine's death, that the drinking was self-medication. That might have helped explain things, Frank. Why didn't you ever get help?" Frank paused at the door. "Because admitting I needed help meant admitting I wasn't in control, and I needed to believe I was still in control of something." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out, I was wrong about that too." The trial of Franklin Joseph Callahan became exactly what the FBI wanted: a public spectacle, a warning to corrupt officers everywhere. The evidence was overwhelming. The video of Frank accepting bribes, the offshore account, the testimony of Dominguez and other dealers who had benefited from his protection. Even Officer Patel testified, visibly uncomfortable but honest about the mailbox incident and his suspicions of Frank's intoxication on duty. Frank's attorney, a public defender named Karen Walsh, did her best. She presented evidence of his previously unblemished record, his service awards, letters from community members he had helped over the years. She emphasized his mental state following his wife's death, the lack of psychological support from the department, the gradual nature of his descent. None of it mattered. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts: racketeering, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, accepting bribes, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Raymond Hamilton peered down at Frank over his reading glasses. "Officer Callahan, you were entrusted with upholding the law and protecting the community. Instead, you chose to betray that trust for personal gain. Your actions not only facilitated the distribution of dangerous drugs in your community, but undermined the very foundation of justice you swore to defend." The judge paused, his gaze unwavering. "The court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison." Frank heard gasps from the gallery former colleagues, a few family members, reporters. 22 years. He would be 84 if he lived to see freedom again. As the bailiffs approached to take him away, Frank caught sight of Chief Davis at the back of the courtroom. Their eyes met briefly, a lifetime of friendship and respect, now tainted beyond repair. Davis turned and walked out without a word. 3 weeks later, Frank arrived at the Federal Correctional Institution in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. The processing was mechanical, stripping away the last vestiges of his identity. Civilian clothes exchanged for a prison uniform, personal belongings catalogued and stored. Fingerprints and photographs taken once more, this time as inmate 36,71948, not as Officer Callahan. His cellmate was a former bank executive serving 12 years for fraud. The man recognized Frank from the news. "Tough break," he said as Frank settled onto the lower bunk. "Cops don't usually do well in here." "I'm aware," Frank replied curtly. The first assault came less than a month into his sentence. 2 inmates cornered him in the laundry room and held him, while the other landed precise blows to his kidneys and ribs. Not enough to require outside medical attention, just enough to send a message. "You're not protected anymore." Frank didn't report it. What would be the point? This was justice of a sort, he supposed. The kind that happened in the shadows, away from courtrooms and procedures. 6 months into his sentence, Frank received his first visitor. Not family, his brother had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with him, and his sister-in-law had stopped responding to his letters. Not former colleagues, the blue wall of silence extended to those who betrayed the badge. It was Officer Patel. "I didn't expect to see you," Frank said as they sat across from each other in the visiting area. Patel looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with the visitor's badge clipped to his shirt. "I didn't expect to come, but I've been thinking about what happened, about that night with the mailbox." Frank waited, his hands folded on the table between them. "I should have reported the DUI," Patel continued. "Maybe if I had, things wouldn't have escalated. Maybe you would have gotten help instead of—" He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "This isn't on you," Frank said firmly. "I made my choices. Every step of the way, I chose wrong." Patel nodded slowly. "The department's different now. New policies, more oversight. Chief Davis resigned last month." "Because of me?" Frank asked, surprised. "Not directly, but the scandal. It changed things. Made people look harder at the whole system." Patel hesitated. "I'm leaving too. Going to law school in the fall." Frank felt a strange mixture of pride and regret. "You'll make a good lawyer. You've got integrity. Don't lose that." As Patel stood to leave, he hesitated once more. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can send?" Frank thought about his sparse cell, the long empty days ahead, the decades stretching before him. "No," he said finally. "Just remember what happened here. Remember how easy it is to slide from who you think you are to someone you never thought you'd become." Patel nodded solemnly. "I won't forget." After he left, Frank was escorted back to his cell. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the blank concrete wall. 21 and a half more years. Would he even recognize the world if he lived to see it again? In his darker moments, Frank hoped he wouldn't have to find out. The thought came to him more often lately that there were ways to end a sentence early, ways that didn't involve appeals or parole boards. He had betrayed everything he once stood for. He had lost his freedom, his reputation, his future. All for what? Money that now sat frozen in accounts he would never access again. Relief from grief that had only deepened into something worse. As the lights dimmed for the night, Frank Callahan, Officer Callahan, respected veteran of the Eastbridge Police Department, lay on his narrow bunk and closed his eyes, haunted by the ghosts of the man he had been and the man he had become. Somewhere in Eastbridge, the police department continued its work without him. Somewhere, Dominguez and his associates served their own sentences. Somewhere, the community rebuilt its trust in those sworn to protect them. And in Cell Block D of Allenwood Federal Correctional Institution, inmate 36,719.48 paid for his betrayal one day at a time, each sunrise bringing him no closer to redemption. The badge that had once defined him now condemned him. The choices that had seemed small had created a chasm too wide to cross. The man who had once embodied justice was now a cautionary tale, a whispered warning in police academies and station houses. Remember Frank Callahan. Remember how quickly the righteous can fall. If you like the story, like and subscribe.